Dynamic accumulators like comfrey have become a hot topic. These are plants that have special properties to absorb large amounts of nutrients from the ground. You can then use these plants to move those nutrients to other plants or into your compost bin and increase the nutrient levels there. Imagine how great this would be. You have a nutrient deficiency in your soil. You go out and buy some of these special plants, grow them in your soil, and because they're so good at accumulating that low nutrient, they now have a high concentration of it. Now you take that and make compost, and now you have this compost that has high levels of the nutrients you need. This is exactly what people are claiming for these dynamic accumulators. Somehow they can gather nutrients you don't really have in your soil and give you a whole bunch of them. In this program, I'd like to examine the idea of dynamic accumulator. What are they, and do they really exist? What are dynamic accumulators? Let's start with a definition. Wikipedia says the following. Dynamic accumulators are plants that gather certain micronutrients, macronutrients, or minerals and store them in their leaves. There are a few key points here. First, they are plants, a good thing since this is a gardening channel. These plants gather nutrients, but the type of nutrients is not specified. The amounts that are gathered are also not specified. The gathered nutrients are then stored in the leaves. Given this definition, almost every plant is a dynamic accumulator since it absorbs nutrients and stores some of them in the leaves. An exception would be the leafless orchid. This does not seem like a very useful definition. The Permaculture Research Institute defines dynamic accumulators this way. Plants, often deep-rooted ones, will drop nutrients from the lower layers of the soil, and these nutrients will be stored in the plant's leaves. Any nutrient in any amount qualifies, provided that it is taken from the lower levels of soil, whatever that means. Is 3 inches deep a lower level? Does it need to be 6 inches deep? Is it subsoil? This definition is also not very useful. What is very surprising is that I was not able to find a better definition. Several other authors have also looked for a definition and the origin of the term. They concluded that there are many definitions, all similar and all fairly vague. I also checked Google Scholar for scientific papers on the topic, and it seems scientists do not use the term. The term dynamic accumulator is used mostly by permaculturists, and they tend not to define their terms and ideas. The whole permaculture thing is a very squishy, non-scientific affair where undefined terms are common, maybe even preferred. By definition, dynamic accumulators are what you want them to be. As an aside, the terms biodynamic accumulator and dynamic nutrient accumulator seem to be the same thing as dynamic accumulator. Maybe the origin of the term will shed some light on our understanding. Even this seems to be a mystery. The Permaculture Research Institute suggests that the term might have been started by Robert Korik, who, in his book Designing and Maintaining Your Edible Landscape, naturally presented a list of dynamic accumulators. If this was not the first use of the term, Robert Korik certainly popularized the term by making the list of dynamic accumulators available. The list has been copied many times with some modifications and forms the basis of the current lists found on the internet. This is what Robert had to say recently. Most accumulator lists originated with the 2-page list in my 1986 book, Designing Your Edible Landscape Naturally. I no longer believe that list is useful. Since there is no good definition for dynamic accumulators, let's create one. A dynamic accumulator is a plant that will absorb and retain in the leaf at least one nutrient at levels that are at least 10 times higher than the average plant. Where did the 10 times value come from? I just pulled it out of the air. Without some value, the definition becomes useless. Given the variability between plants and soils, a tenfold factor seems reasonable. Some might argue that an important point is missing from this definition since it does not talk about where the nutrients are gathered. Many people believe that dynamic accumulators have high levels of nutrients because they have deep roots. The deep root gives the plant access to extra nutrients. I'll discuss this in a future program, but the idea that higher nutrient levels are the result of deep roots is mostly a myth. Do dynamic accumulators exist? If we use the established definition, then the answer is yes. By that definition, every plant that's grown is a dynamic accumulator. That doesn't really help us. What if we use my new definition? Well, the answer is still yes. There are dynamic accumulators. There's been a lot of work done on hyperaccumulators and phytoaccumulators. These are plants that are really good at pulling up heavy metals from soil, and they're used in remediation programs. So when you have an area with contaminated soil, they plant certain plants that are good to pick up the metals that are contaminating the soil. Then they take the plant material away from the soil and dispose of it somewhere else. Slowly over time, the amount of heavy metals in this soil drop. We know those plants exist, and we know that this method actually works. It's kind of a slow method to remediate soil, but it actually works very effectively. A hyperaccumulator is defined as a plant that can accumulate 1,000 milligrams per kilogram of copper, cobalt, chromium, nickel, and lead, or 10,000 milligrams per kilo of iron, manganese, and zinc. Now that's all very interesting, but it doesn't really help most gardeners. What gardeners are interested in are plants that accumulate the nutrients that we need for our plants: phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen, calcium, magnesium, and maybe even the micronutrients, although most soil isn't deficient in those. And more important to a gardener is, are there some plants I should be growing, harvesting, and using to make my compost better? I'll have a look at those questions in a different program. But I have made a special program about comfrey, which is the most popular dynamic accumulator that gardeners use. And you get to that right here. Happy gardening.